Well, good evening, everybody. It's 7 o'clock. I know people are just getting settled, and I just wanted to say thanks for being here this evening. And thank you for asking me, Father Duncan and Claire, to do one of these sessions for Advent. Um, as you can see, this is going to be a very brief overview of the history of Celtic Christianity in the British Isles. Um, and I named it that because I thought it might be a good thing to create a springboard, if you will, for the next three sessions. I know you're going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive with Father John next week in St. Patrick, with St. Patrick. There's going to be one with Duncan for spirituality, and Claire, I think you're doing holy spaces. So these are all very, very Celtic themes. But my question was, well, how did this all start? So tonight we are going to scratch the surface of who the ancient Celts were and how their collision with Christianity changed them and, of course, changed us and changed Christianity. But I first would like to start out with a little prayer. So please pray with me. The three who are over me, the three who are below me, the three who are above me here, the three who are above me yonder, the three who are in the earth, the three who are in the air, the three who are in the heaven, the three who are in the great pouring sea. Amen. We'll talk a little bit later where that came from, but Claire, would you change to the next slide? And I just want to say thank you to Claire because I actually can't run on my iPad the slideshow. So thank you for putting it together and for helping me out tonight. So who were these ancient Celts? The reality is we don't know a whole lot about them. And what we do know are from other sources. We know about the Celts from archaeological digs and from recorded accounts by basically their enemies. So we don't have this terrific outlook on the Celtic culture, but there is an awful lot that is there. Um, First of all, the Celtic culture is thought to have emerged around 1200 BCE, which is really a long time ago. And they held a very, very large part of Europe and did a lot of mobility through there. They are a distinct ethnic group. And this group that moved across Europe shared similar languages, traditions, religions, and cultural practices. If you can go to the next slide, I love this slide because it really gives you an idea of the range of where the Celtic people were. The oldest settlement is actually in Austria, and there have been a tremendous amount of things that were found there. But as you can see, these people moved around. They moved into the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. They moved up, obviously, into the British Isles. Now, during this time, Rome is doing Romans things. And I don't know if any of you remember that film Gladiator, right? Um, Gladiator was in the very beginning, they were fighting. And of course, Rome eventually pushed this line of Celtic, uh, uh, sorry, I'm having trouble speaking tonight, where all the Celts lived and had their culture back to a farther place. And we'll talk about that later, but I want you to get this visual idea of where they were around 400 BC. So if you can go to the next slide, the Celts were fierce warriors. They were strong. They were skilled horsemen. In fact, there are accounts by the Romans saying that they did these things with chariots that were just so incredible that they tried to emulate them. And they, of course, the Romans perceived these people as a bunch of barbarians. In fact, the name Gauli or Gaul is their word for barbarian. And that whole area that you saw before in red or in Burgundy was called Gaul. It was called the land of the barbarians. Rome first mentioned them in the 7th century CE, and they depicted them as savages, right? Uncultured, unrestrained people, barbarians. But unlike the Romans, um, they were a little bit different. They had their territory and they stayed in their territory. But when provoked, they, of course, were very fierce warriors. So, in order to prove a point, the Celts actually sacked Rome in 390 BCE. But unlike Rome, they didn't go and say, okay, well, now it's mine. That was the difference between these two cultures. They sacked Rome and then went home. Rome, when it started to make its move through Europe, sacked it and stayed and built their culture throughout Europe. They were known for their long hair and their imposing physique. These were big, strong people. And in Greek art, they are depicted with these wonderful wooden shields that were highly decorated and these long swords. And one of the things that really bothered the Romans is that women could be warriors. Women were given very special titles and were given a great deal more respect in the Celtic world than they were in Rome. I love the picture up in the corner of this horned helmet. And this was found in London close to Waterloo Bridge, and it's known as the Waterloo helmet. But you can just see the detail in this. I didn't get an age in that. I think it's from the British Museum. There are actually a lot of pictures online of the British Museum's um, artifacts that they have from the Celts. If you can go to the next slide, we'll also see this amazing chariot, this Celtic wagon. And again, the detail, this was from approximately the 5th century BCE. So these people were talented. They were craftsmen. They were artisans. They had communities. You can go to the next slide as well. They also were very advanced in their weaponry. They were the first group of people to develop and use iron for weapons, which gave them an advantage because it was a material that was much stronger than bronze. So these are just types of Celtic swords. And when I look at that picture, I also see the detail in the scabbards. So they crafted beautiful pieces of weaponry as well as other things. And the next slide, you'll see one of the other things that they crafted. And to me, this is not a civilization of barbarians if you can make this kind of work. Celtic life did have some larger city areas, but mostly it was agricultural. There were little farmsteads where groups of families would live. They were farmers, they bred cattle and horses. We know from other accounts that they wore bright colored clothing and they adorned themselves in gold. And that torque is actually just a beautiful example of some of the jewelry that has been found. This was found in England. The Romans say they were barbarians, and yet hygiene was very important. In these archaeological digs, they found so many grooming tools, so they knew that this Roman account couldn't quite be accurate. And there apparently was evidence that the Celts introduced soap to the Romans. Up until that point, Roman bathing used to be a scraping type of a cleaning. And it was even mandatory in some of the tribes that the men would bathe before the evening meal. So hygiene was important. We know they were incredible artisans and craftsmen because of what was left behind. But we also know that they loved poetry. And as we'll talk a little bit further when we talk about the Druids, they loved the recitation of sagas. It was an oral tradition. So they would sit around the fire like so many of the other early people and recall these stories and tell these stories. They were a very strong tribal community. And, this when I write down here, the excommunication of somebody who didn't conform to its customs was really part of a survival technique. You did what you had to do so that you could stay strong and survive. Um, Life was a whole lot different than it is today. So the more people you had working together, the easier it became. If you go to the next slide, it also just shows again some of the artistry from 50 BC, this beautiful reverse side of a mirror, and start to take note too of this artwork, these curves, this style of work. The shield on the very right hand side was said to be part of a larger piece. This would have sat in the middle, and the larger wooden piece would have been behind it. And I love the piece in the middle, this carnax. And the sound of it was dreadful, like listening to animals being slaughtered. If that didn't scare the enemy, I don't know what would have. But that was found up close to Aberdeen, Scotland. The Celtic religion, going to the next slide, was a polytheistic religion. But a lot of the pieces of this have kind of trickled down, and you'll start to, as we talk a little bit about how it crosses over to Christianity, where it intersects. They loved creation and all nature, but they really respected nature. They understood the power of nature. They understood that a storm could come up and ruin a crop, and therefore people would go hungry. So there was a real healthy respect for creation as well as a love of it. And they were very aware of a spiritual world. The prayer that I read talked about, God everywhere. And this comes from the Celts. They really had an understanding of an unseen world. They perceived this unseen world, and it was part of their culture. It was part of their life. Instead of building buildings for worship, they used sacred groves. And they believed that there were places where these physical and spiritual worlds kind of came to touch each other in this understanding that we call tissue paper thin, which I think comes from George MacLeod. But these thin places where that world that we can't see and the world that we can see are just so close together that they're touching, but they almost collide. If we go to the next slide, it's about the Druids. And I found this wonderful little statue from Ireland of a Druid. We don't really know what they looked like. And everything that we do know is kind of secondhand knowledge. But we can say that they weren't the hooded people that sort of walked around Stonehenge looking at the solstice. They may have had that kind of a thing, but there was more to them. Druids were the Celtic upper class. They were the lawyers, the advisors. They were the orators. They were the scientists. They blessed people. They were also the ones that were mobile in the society. So they would go from a farmstead or a community and share the news. They were the communicators of all the tribes. They also believed that they were literate, although the doctrine of recording their knowledge was forbidden in their culture, in their faith, in their religion. And the word druid possibly comes from the Greek word drus, which is the word for oak, strong oak. And it made me think about, if you ever go to England, there are these, up in the north especially, there are these great little figurines up on the columns. They're called the green people. And oftentimes there'll be this little face and there'll be these wonderful oak leaves that just sort of surround them. I wonder if this is sort of a heralding back to those early pagan days. Let's just go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the Romans. Prior to Rome getting into Britain, Cornwall was a major classical hub, and it was because of tin, right? So all of us who watch Poldark know about the Cornish tin, but Cornish tin was being traded before Christ. And it was with Greece, it was with all of the Mediterranean areas. So, of course, Rome wanted to get their hand in some of this. And once they made their way through Europe, they made an invasion to England, and it started about 55 BCE. It took them probably 80 or 90 years before they really started calling it a province of Britain, because the Celts were really fierce warriors. In fact, there's a story of, I'm going to probably say the name wrong, but Boudica, who was the female warrior. And she fought so hard that the Romans were just completely confounded with her. And eventually she did lose battle, and she committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Romans. But she is revered as one of the greatest warriors of the time and is written about by the Romans. The other two dates I think that are really important are the date of 313, which is when Constantine accepted Christianity as a legal religion, as a true religion. Before this time, Christianity was really considered an illegal religion. Christians were being persecuted for centuries. Constantine changed that. And in 323, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, not without a lot of changes, because when you start to look at early Christianity, you start to see how cultures have shaped and changed it to the Christianity that we practice now. Okay. And one other final slide, and then I'm going to stop for a moment for some questions. But I love this picture. This shows where the Romans were in about 150 AD. Londinium, that was London. If you ever go to the Museum of London. In the middle of London, you'll see part of a Roman wall that was really a Roman wall. If you ever get to the little town outside St. Albans, that is a really cool town. It was a huge Roman settlement. And when the Romans left in 410, they literally left. They picked up and went. And this particular Verulamium, I think it was called, there was this whole settlement there. When Christianity came in, they took all of the brickwork from the houses that were Romans and built the church there. So it's really kind of interesting. Of course, Bath, huge Roman settlement, Roman area. And if you look farther up north, you'll see Hadrian's Wall. Well, that was put there to keep out the Celts, the Picts, the Scots, all those barbarians that wanted to come down and interrupt Rome's occupation of Britain. So we're going to just take a moment. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? I want to just say right away, I am a novice in this, and I am not by any means a scholar, but I'm really having fun learning a lot about the early Celtic people. But any questions at all? Just take yourself off mute because I can't see everyone. Well, I don't think we have any questions, so let's move on. And I'll have Claire bring me.
I think you might have a question. Gladys,
okay.
Do you have a question?
I just think it's an excellent presentation, and I'm learning a lot. So
Well, thank you.
I have a statement.
Thank you. So let's learn a little bit about Christianity and the Celtic Church and that timeline. So what we do know about the Celtic Church is a couple of things. One is that there really isn't an official date for the first Christian mission. We do know that it was by Irenaeus of Lyon, who died in 202 CE, and he died in Gaul. So he died somewhere in France, probably. But historians really believe that Christianity came to Britain earlier, probably in the 1st or 2nd century. Now, there's also a lot of mythology that's wrapped around that too. There are tales of either Peter or Paul making their way all the way to Britain to convert the Picts and convert the early Celts. But there's also the story of Joseph of Arimathea, who we know buried the body of Christ, but supposedly had the Grail, okay, the chalice, the cup used at the Last Supper, and supposedly the Holy Grail is in Glastonbury. But again, this is supposition, this is myth. They've never found it, and nobody really knows. But we do know from early church writings, from Tertullian and Origen, that in the first years of the 3rd century, Christian communities were already in Britain, and they were probably there even earlier. Celtic Christianity, when we think about it, generally flourished from approximately the 5th to the 12th centuries. And then there were changes, okay? There was something called the Synod at Whitby in 664. When Constantine made the Roman Church and took on Christianity, there were certain things that were done that were Roman, okay? Well, there's a lot of space between Rome and Great Britain. Plus, you had the influence of the Celtic Church. And these Ionian, coming from the word Iona, which is the Holy Isle, these two traditions sort of clashed a bit. And this particular synod was the first moment where they started to accept certain pieces of Roman rule. Eventually, the Roman Church kind of took over all of Great Britain in the 12th century. But at the synod, there were two things that they talked about. One was the date of Easter, because they both had different ways of calculating the date. And the other thing was the haircut, okay? And I love this. The Roman tonsure was a circle. It was like a crown. But the Celts did their hair a little bit differently. They had the sort of semicircle that went in. And at the Synod of Whitby, they decided to go with the Roman Church on these two particular things. And when I was putting this together, we were laughing about the fact that it took, another 600 years so that everybody got the right haircut. But if we go to the next slide, this isn't perfect, but it does give you an idea of where the Celtic Church has still got some sway and where it really flourished. Obviously, Ireland was a big place over in the green. The part in the blue in Scotland doesn't really show Northumbria. Northumbria is a little bit along the line of the blue and also the gray. The Isle of Man, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. For our presentation tonight, we're not going to be talking about Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, or the Isle of Man for two reasons. One, I just didn't get enough time to research it, and two, we only have an hour. So we're going to give as brief an overview as we can. But this gives you an idea of these little strongholds. So what was the early Celtic Church? In those areas that you saw was where the Celtic Church flourished. But they weren't they weren't connected completely. They weren't united administratively, as you would, but they were united in a lot of other things, and their beliefs were very, very similar. Their monastic communities were hubs of life. There was something called anamcaras that we'll talk about later, these friendships among the early saints, respect for women's gifts, huge in the Celtic Church. And they all had and practiced a common spirituality. What we got from their pagan ancestors were this wonderful poetic imagination and this artistic creativity that today we still admire and marvel at. Kinship relationships, the warmth of a hearth, the wonder of stories, the guidance of dreams. You know, the guidance of dreams is something that's very biblical, but the Roman Church pulled away from some of that. We read about it, but they believe that there's connections. There's a whole lot more connections. In the next slide, the Celtic Church was affected by the beauty of the landscape and the sea. They were surrounded by water, the elements, the moon, the stars. These all had significance. And again, like the Celts, there was this healthy respect for these things too. There's a rock, literally a rock called Scalig Michael that's off the coast of Ireland. I've only read about it. I'd love to go sometime. But it's a rock in the middle of the ocean. And there was a community, a monastery that was there. There was a healthy respect for the sea and the understanding that God was part of that sea. He was part of the rock. He was part of the sun and the moon and all of the elements that surrounded them. The early Celtic Church, too, was very influenced as well by the early Christian desert fathers and mothers. This is a very big connection, as well as some of the pagan roots. The early Christians believed in a very simple lifestyle. We know from the church too, or from the writings, that in fact, actually, let me just back up for a second. Historians believe that these desert people, these desert Christians, there were actually more women than men out in the desert. We know about the men, we know a little bit about the women, but even the men talked about this equality in the eyes, for everyone, in the eyes of God. This continued in the Celtic Church. And there was also an understanding in the desert, as well as in Celtic culture, that you could meet God anywhere, in anything that you did, in anything that you had contact with. So the Celtic Church then flowered into, if you go to the next slide, these amazing monastic cities that were not just places of prayer and worship, but they were areas of education. And I think, I'm trying to remember what I read, because I read a lot about this, but there were at one time 160 like universities or schools in Ireland during the height of the Dark Ages, quote unquote. And they said that Ireland was actually, because of these monastic cities, a place where education was just ran rampant. We think about Celtic culture now when we look at those high crosses, and they were carved like stained glass windows later on were meant to teach the illiterate the stories of the Bible. The high crosses were there to do the same thing. And it's believed that the workmanship and the carvings on the high crosses actually started in Iona. We know, we look at the illuminated Gospels, the Book of Kells, which is just remarkable. Again, that was produced on Iona, and because of the Viking raids was eventually moved to Kells, Ireland. The Celtic Church also brought us this wonderful ministry of spiritual mentoring, this idea of cara, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But it really has brought us these things and many other things. Going to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the heavy hitters, if you will. And again, we're only looking Ireland, Scotland, Northumbria, but hagiography. So this is a style of biography, if you will, that is not completely historically accurate. It's a type of genre in literature that's written so that we understand the saints as mentors. These stories are written to inspire us, and to hopefully inspire us to emulate these wonderful qualities and these personalities in these lives. Oftentimes, these stories are larger than life, but the truths can move us to a greater self-awareness. And this is all of these readings of these saints, as fantastical as they are, can inspire us to be to have a closer relationship with God. And also, too, one other thing to note is that Celtic saints are often a compilation of their pagan forebears. Now, we do know certain things about some of them, but one of them that we'll talk about in a little bit, we know definitely that there was a very, probably a melding of two people into one. So if we go to the next slide, Saint Ninian was actually one of the earliest ones. Ninian founded a monastery on the Isle of Whithorn in southern Scotland. And what I think is amazing is that the first time I ever went to Scotland, this was actually the first thing I ever saw. And it happened very accidentally. I was staying at someone's home and dealing with jet lag, and a bunch of us went out for a walk and came across this. And Ninian was the first Christian missionary to Scotland, was really responsible for conversions. And the church is on the left. It's surrounded by a fence so that you have to go through it so the cows and the sheep don't wander through it all the time. And on the right is Ninian's cave. And that's where he lived. He lived in a cave. The next slide is, of course, one of the ones that we know all about, St. Patrick. St. Patrick was the what they call part of the Irish Trinity, and he was a 5th century missionary to Ireland. You're going to hear a lot more about him from Father John, I think next week. But he is credited with bringing Christianity to a lot of Ireland. He was captured by the Irish, or the Celts, the Picts, and was a slave, and then escaped and came back. And the story goes that his cara, his soul friend, was the one who convinced him he had to go back. And we give thanks for that, because, and I'm sure the Irish do too. But St. Patrick is always depicted with a shamrock in his hand. The rock in the center is actually a picture of his supposed gravesite. And I love the stained glass window of him baptizing those heathens, quote unquote, the pagans around him. The next saint is Saint Brigid. She's also one of the Irish Trinity. She was a nun. She was actually the saint that most historians believe is very closely linked, if not the same person, as the pagan Saint Brigid. Okay. And Father John, you're going to like this about her, but one of her miracles was that she apparently changed water into beer. But what she wrote about the cara, which I thought was just delightful, was she said, a person without a soul friend is like a body without a head. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how important this was to the Celtic Church. Her cross is the square cross that's there, and a stained glass rendition of supposedly her. The next slide is also the final of the three, Saint Columba. Saint Columba founded the monastery on Iona, that place that hopefully we can go to next year. the veil between heaven and earth. And there's a lot of speculation as to why Columba actually left Ireland, but he got to Iona and he climbed the mountain and said, I can't see Ireland, so this must be the place to go. And there must be the place to stay. His Irish name means the dove of the church. And he is really credited to starting this community that not only became a huge community of worship and learning, literacy, creativity. As I said before, the high crosses and the Book of Kells, they believed all came from the island of Iona. But they also manufactured a lot of saints and a lot of pilgrims and a lot of brothers to go out into the world and to found and to be missionaries. The picture on the right is actually Columba's beach. I decided not to put a picture of the abbey because the abbey isn't Columba's. It's a Benedictine abbey. But this is the beach where he supposedly landed in his little coracle. And you can see him in the stained glass window to the left in his little coracle with his brothers. The picture in the center, actually, I took when I was there, and that's from the abbey. Going to the next slide, we're going to go to St. Hild of Whitby. This is Northumbria. St. Hild was a remarkable woman. She did come from the aristocracy. She was the daughter of a king, and she founded a monastery that was for both men and women at Whitby. She was the one too that hosted this synod at Whitby, and she accepted this decision to favor Rome on the haircuts and the Easter date rather than the older Celtic traditions. The picture on the left I love because here's Saint Aidan, who we'll talk about a little bit in a moment, but he's coming to Hild for advice as a soul friend. This wonderful picture of Hild in the center too, the carving with the faces around of the men who she inspired to become important people, inspirational mentors in the Celtic Church. And of course, the remnants of the church in Whitby, the monastery in Whitby. And for those of you who were on that trip at St. John's so many years ago, that was the inspiration for Bram Stoker as well, for the Dracula. a fun piece. The next slide, we talk about St. Aidan. St. Aidan was responsible for another monastery, a very famous monastery on another holy island called Lindisfarne. And Lindisfarne, like Mont Saint-Michel in France and Mount St. Michael in Cornwall, are on islands that you can walk to at low tide, but they are completely secluded. You have to get there by boat when the tide comes in. So in order today to get to Lindisfarne, you still have to, look at the tides because that's the only time you can cross it. But that's St. Aidan. And of course, the last one I have here is St. Cuthbert. Both Aidan and Cuthbert were buried in Lindisfarne. Their relics were removed. Aidan's, I think, went back to Iona. And this was all during the Viking raids and invasions. But Cuthbert is really looked upon as the saint of the Northumbrian Church. He is buried in Durham Cathedral. And the picture on the left is actually an image of him at the cathedral. But the one on the right, I really like. One of the miracles that's said to surround Cuthbert was that after he died, he didn't decompose. So he was brought back up to be moved because, again, they wanted to keep his relics from the invaders. and he was in perfect condition like the day they put him in. So
Wow.
that is some of our saints. So
Mhm.
again, any questions thus far?
Not yet. This
Thanks,
is
Liz.
wonderful.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Could you explain, do you want me to stop the share? Here, I can stop it for a minute.
sure.
Could you explain one more time, cara?
I will actually. So hold that question because I have a slide for it.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Any other questions before we go on? Okay, good. So let's go back to that PowerPoint and just take a moment to look at some of the differences between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. So the first two items that you'll see on the top, this was the Synod of Whitby, the hairstyle and the dates of Easter. But there were also other big differences between the church. Rome started building a lot of large churches and basilicas for common liturgies and worship. The Celtic Church was much more personal. It was smaller structures. They later became stone, but they were intimate. And that was an important piece to their belief and their mission and their ministering to the community. As Rome became more materialistic, as the bishops started dressing in great outfits and they rode in these wonderful thrones, the Celtic brothers and priests really believed in this much more simple lifestyle. They followed the desert mothers and fathers' roots. And it was very different. And also, too, another different, there are others here, these are just some of the big ones. Rome isolated women. And of course, the Celts embraced them. They really encouraged their leadership in the church. So, Celtic spirituality, if we go to the next slide, it really is the foundation for our faith as Episcopalians, the Anglican Church, Methodist spirituality. The foot washing service was actually started by the Celtic Church. And I don't know about any of you, but that's one of my favorite ones. I mean, we all get nervous about taking off our shoes and socks, but it's such a intimate experience. And I think that's why it was so well received. Because of also this connection with the desert mothers and fathers, there is a great connectivity too with the Eastern Orthodox Church, even more so than Rome. There's also resonance with Native American spirituality in regards to their focus on nature, the spiritual realm, this respect for ancestors, dreams, and visions. Esther de Waal wrote, "The Gaelic race sees the hand of God in every place, in every time, and in everything. They have this sense of life embraced on all sides by God." In the next slide, you just get an idea of how this idea, this Celtic spirituality, has influenced people that we know and people that we regard in the church today. Hildegard of Bingen, St. Francis, huge. I mean, I think about, when I read about St. Francis, I often think I'm reading about the early Celtic Church. Julian of Norwich, Joan of Arc, George Herbert, Evelyn Underhill, Thomas Merton. Influences that are far-reaching. So some of the terms that I've been talking about and some of the jumping points of the important points of Celtic spirituality. I'm going to go through a couple of them. One is this cara. So cara in Gaelic means soul friend. And it's a friend that walks the journey of faith with you. As Saint Brigid said, it's, to not have an anam cara is like not to have a head with your body. It's really essential. It's really important. Edward Selner, who's a good authority on a lot of Celtic stuff, if you will, wrote, "To be a soul friend is to provide a cell, a place of sanctuary to another, where through our acceptance, love, and hospitality, he or she can grow in wisdom, and both of us in depth." So it's a place where both gain, not just the mentor-mentee relationship. It's really where both friends grow in wisdom. The roots for anam cara is from the Druids, but it's also from the early desert dwellers. In the desert, there would be people that would come to visit the mothers and fathers to get a word, just a word from them. And these are the things that we have written down today, are these words that came back. Mother so-and-so, Mother Syncletica said this, or Father Anthony said that. And this is where that comes from. And today it kind of translates into that spiritual direction or spiritual companioning. It's a role where we ask the spiritual director asks those questions to get the directee to open up a little more, to listen deeper, to discern where God is calling them in their lives. And anam cara helps us to recognize God in our midst. And an anam cara doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's trained. And I ask you, if we had more time, I would break us all into groups and have you think about, well, who's been an anam cara in my life? And although I've had a spiritual director and I've, spoken to priests, I've had anam caras too that were people who walked with me and held me up and asked those difficult questions. And you don't have to be ordained to do that. On the next slide, the other thing that was really important to the Celts was prayer. St. Paul wrote about praying without ceasing. And this is really a connection, this pivotal connection that we have to have an ongoing relationship with the divine. Again, another practice from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, they called it anamnesis. It's this constant prayerful remembrance of God, this sense of God's presence, everything, everywhere, in everything that we do, no matter how mundane or boring or simple it is. The Celts also had a lot of prayers that we think about as Celtic today. The Lorica, which is the prayer of protection. You'll hear about that next week with St. Patrick. The Chaim prayers, the encircling prayers that, you say this, the Trinity was extremely important, but to say all of the Trinity as this oneness and while as you're being encircled by it. The Carmina Gadelica, this I have to mention, and I'm going to just quickly show it to you here. I was really fortunate to get a copy of this, and Father John may talk a little bit more about it. It is it's a compilation of hymns and incantations from the Scottish Highlands. And this gentleman, Alexander Carmichael, did this really as a labor of love. He was a civil servant and spoke to people and started recording all of these prayers and stories and little incantations and runes down. And if he didn't do that, we wouldn't have them today. It's really a remarkable volume. And I was able to get this when I was in Scotland. It's finally been in enough reprints where it's come down to a price that's affordable. So if you ever can get one, it's really remarkable. They believed in prayer too, that everything can be turned over to God. We remember Brother Lawrence, who said even washing the dishes, you can pray and you can realize that you're doing this for God. You're having this relationship because Christ is everywhere. Jesus is everywhere. The Spirit is everywhere. God is everywhere. So prayer is hugely important. Another thing that's hugely important is this idea of the thin space. So in the next slide, it's this terrific ideal that there are holy places that may be sacred sites, but it's the place where that veil is so thin that we can feel what the divine is. We are that close. We know that the Holy Spirit is as close as our breath. And what the Celts believed, people will say, oh, you have to go to some place to do that. But they believed that any environment that invites transformation in us and a place that invites us to be honest before God is a thin space. So if that means that's your armchair, that's a thin space. These places are all around us. And it's just a matter of being aware, being alert, being attentive to where God is intersecting in your life. And they believe that God intersects at all places and in all things. And of course, the first and the best thin place has to be our own souls. So if it's sitting in that armchair and finding God, that armchair is going to keep calling you back because that has become a thin space. It's sometimes difficult, and even with the trip to Iona, to say that Iona is a thin place. It is for some, but not all places on Iona are thin. And again, when you're open to that, you're more likely to experience that and to realize that God is there and everywhere. But the divine will show the divine's face in the divine time. The other thing that's very unique and important in Celtic Christianity is pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was not like our idea of pilgrimage today or our idea of traveling today. It's not a destination, okay? The journey is the pilgrimage, getting there, being transformed by the journey. The journey was undertaken to be closer to God. So when we look back in Scripture, journeying is a tradition that's been around for a long time. Abraham, Moses, Paul, we can think of a lot of others. It also allowed the brothers, remember that map, the very first map I showed you with where the Celts were. It allowed these Celtic Christians to go out as evangelists and as missioners, and not to do it in a way that wasn't loving and caring, but to spread this good news, spread the gospel, which means good news. And that's why you'll find a lot of Celtic influence up in the very northern part of Europe, and throughout Germany, Belgium, the northern parts, Norway, that area. They went all over, as well as obviously through England and Ireland and Wales. The goal of the journey was spiritual transformation. And of course, like we all know, and what they believed is that the most difficult journey and the longest journey is that journey that's inward. So pilgrimage doesn't necessarily have to be leaving that armchair. It's that journey within and inside of us. The other thing that's really important is that idea of silence and solitude. These are disciplines of withdrawal, but it's not the understanding of withdrawing from the world because the world is such a horrible place. It's a way to leave the world so that we can be rejuvenated and strengthened, so that when we come back in, we can be a better member of our community. We can engage with God and with God's people in a different way. When we go into solitude, we're forced to let go of all that stuff that keeps us from God, and allow God to put to death what's false or what's not real within us. And in silence, of course, we're forced to listen, and it takes practice. I don't know about any of you, but my silence oftentimes is not silence. It's this running, oh my gosh, I have this to do. I have to take care of that. I have to do whatever. So it's really important that we, as Christians, take this particular nugget of Celtic spirituality and practice it. And it's not things, and it's not just in Celtic spirituality, these Sabbath practices, going on silent retreats, quiet days. These are all ways in which we can let go enough so that we can start to hear God. We can get rid of the clatter, the chatter, the constant nagging, all this that goes on in our heads, and listen to what God is saying coming from our heart. I want to just touch on one other thing before we kind of close for a couple of minutes of questions. And that's, of course, some of the symbols. And I didn't put a lot down here, but some of them are really pretty incredible. And we see them in so much of the artwork. But in Celtic art, the snake is a symbol of resurrection, because the snake can shed its skin. It can let go of what's old and start new. The high cross, as I mentioned too, was this way of teaching those who couldn't read some of the stories of the Bible. The actual cross is a symbol of Christ. It's a reminder to us of who we owe our allegiance to, right? Now, the circle is something that may be there for practical reasons, because to have the arms going out, it weakens the structure. So they may have thought, well, we'll put a circle in there that will strengthen it up. But it also can be a symbol of the sun. It can be a symbol of the cosmic Christ. It can be a symbol of the garland of victory for the victorious Christ. It can be a symbol of the world and Christ. So that's really up to how we want to look at it, because we don't really know. The knots, Celtic knots, they don't have a beginning. They don't have an end. Of course, that's Alpha and Omega, right? If we look at that one picture down there of the 3-ringed knot, it doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end, but it certainly is a commitment to the Trinity. And that dance with the Trinity, if you will. The tree of life symbolizes imagination and intuition. Henry Nouwen talked tremendously about imagination and how important it is that we have that. We need to think outside the box. I had a coach once who said a wonderful thing. He said, Leslie, you first have to understand the box, but then you need to think outside of it. And it's true, right? And of course, the shamrock in Ireland is a symbol of the Trinity. And the final picture I have in this PowerPoint is this marvelous picture taken from the Book of Kells. So this book, and they actually have found another one in a bog that it remarkably was preserved, and they're hoping to have it restored enough so it will be out on display in the next 10 or 20 years. But the Book of Kells is this illuminated art. The pages are calf skin. The ink is made from a variety of plants and berries, probably blood as well. And each of these lines, talk about we would say a labor of love, but a labor of prayer, because the monks took the time to pray through all of this as well. But they would have to take their pen knife, literally, to make a mark into the hide so that they could then put in this color and this ink. And if you look really deeply, there are all these little circles and different heads of different animals. This is obviously a picture of Christ. But the birds, there's snakes in there. There are other images. They're just remarkable. You can find a lot of this online. Wonderful pieces of art to meditate to. Excuse me. So we have hit 8 o'clock. I'm surprised I got through all those slides. But are there any questions?
Oh, I want more.
Next Tuesday at 7 o'clock.
I'm loving this. I'm loving it. You should have this as a recording.
I recorded it. I was thinking about how the high cross reminds me of the Native American totem.
Yeah, it does.
And in similar ways too, they were also used as boundaries, as well as these markers of Christendom, if you will.
Absolutely wonderful. Oh, I could listen to this for all night. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you.
What I love about these areas is as you walk through them, and I've done quite a bit of hiking in Celtic areas, these crosses are everywhere, and they're so magnificent, and they've been there so long, and each place is such a holy place. You can't imagine how many people have walked these same pilgrimage walks and stopped to pray right there where you're standing. And it just does something, this thin place idea. It is just amazing what happens to a place when so many people pray from that spot.
Terrific. Yeah.
Thank you, Lex.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. This is
Thank
wonderful.
you so very much. Actually, it's very, very good.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed it.
So hopefully this
so
prepares
wonderful,
us for the next couple of sessions.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're doing the Celtic Christianity, which I've always admired, and I always find it so refreshing after the huge buildings and outside structures that we've created and we've come to associate with Christianity. It is so wonderful to get back to some of the more basic, more natural things that, in so many ways, I think can be more religious, certainly more inspiring.
Right.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
so.
I mean, the Celts truly believed that we were all created. Everything was created by God. So in a sense, we all have that stardust, right? That even the rocks have that stardust. They're all created by God. So, go talk to some rocks. Listen to what the rocks have to say. They're a lot older than we are.
Thank
I
you.
do have a prayer to close us out. If anybody has any questions, we'll quickly answer them, and I'll just like to pray us away
I
again
just
from
like
this.
to say that it brought us back to our trips to Scotland.
Yeah, good,
Lovely.
good.
Very nice job.
Thank you, Jane.
Leslie, I do have a question. Are there
Yeah.
any prayer books, Celtic prayer books that you might recommend?
Yes, there's a lot. Father John was preaching or reading prayers from David Adam tonight. Wonderful, wonderful writer. One of my favorites is John O'Donohue. There's a terrific book, I have it close by, that he wrote of prayers. It's called To Bless the Space Between Us. Just beautiful, but his writing, it just speaks to me. There are some books. J. Philip Newell also has some books on Celtic prayer. Esther de Waal. There's a lot.
It's just great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, David Adams' The Cry of the Dare, which I absolutely love. It
Yes.
could be a primer for an everyday prayers,
Yep. And he also wrote one called Tides and Seasons. And also, too, the Celtic prayer book, the Northumbrian Community, has that beautiful yellow prayer book. I have it down here, too. I'm just not going to grab it. But that's also a wonderful way if you need a pickup or something different for morning or evening prayer. It's a great option, too.
Leslie,
Yes.
if I may say something about what you just said, Sue and I have both used that together.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to end your day with Compline, there are 7 different Complines in that Celtic prayer book, one for every day of the week, and you alternate parts of it with your spouse. And it is a wonderful and glorious way to end a day with your husband or wife.
Mm-hmm. And that book is nice, too, because it also it gives you a little bit of all the Celtic saints, too. And there are a lot. There are more Celtic saints than are Roman saints, actually. Yeah. Well, let us pray. And this is, again, from the Carmina Gaudelica. And since we are in Advent, I thought this might be appropriate. The child of glory, the child of Mary, born in the stable, the King of all, who came to the wilderness and in our stead suffered. Happy are they counted who to him are near. When he himself saw that we were in travail, heaven opened graciously over our head. We beheld Christ, the Spirit of truth. The same drew us in 'neath the shield of his crown. Strengthen our hope, enliven our joyance. Keep us valiant, faithful, and near. O light our lantern along with the virgins, singing in glory the anthem new. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Would you end the recording and then send that into Coral, and she'll send it out on Facebook?